Hey, welcome to Restoration. My name is Matt. So glad you could join us on this Shabbat or whatever day you are watching this message. We are continuing our series, Blood Brothers, the story of Jacob. And every family has a story. Betrayal, jealousy, favoritism, silent pain. And here's the good news. God tells his story through a family just as complicated as yours. So today we're in part 8 of Blood Brothers called When God Breaks Through. And here's kind of the central question we'll answer at the end of the message. Why does the Gospel of Matthew include 4 women with scandalous sexual histories in Yeshua's genealogy? And we're going to look at how God's promise breaks through even the most broken situations, from Genesis to Ruth to King David, and ultimately to our Messiah, Yeshua. But first, we got to go back to Genesis 25, when Rebekah was pregnant with twins, Jacob and Esau. In Genesis 25, verse 23, it says, Adonai said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from your body will be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other, but the older will serve the younger. Esau is born the first, the older, and Jacob emerges holding his brother's heel, which is what his name means. But the pattern here is the promised reversal doesn't happen immediately. Jacob's going to wrestle with God, scheme for decades, be transformed before he receives what God was going to give him anyway. And Jacob's story is about striving to become what God promised through deception. And this carries to his children, as we've been talking about this last 7 weeks. And you look at the end of the story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38, verse 27. Now, when it was time for her, Tamar, to give birth, behold, there were twins in her womb. And while she was giving birth, one stuck out his hand. And the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it around his hand, saying, this one came out first. But as he was pulling his hand in, behold, his brother came out. So she said, how you have broken through. The breach is because of you. And they named him Perez. Afterward, his brother, on whose hand was the scarlet thread, came out, and his name was Zerah. So Tamar, Judah's daughter-in-law, is pregnant with twins. And here, the older literally becomes the younger. One twin sticks out his hand first, but Perez, his name means breach, break through. He becomes the firstborn. There's no decades of scheming like Jacob. There's no struggle. God's promise advances decisively, even out of a scandal like his parents, Judah and Tamar. Now, Judah lost 2 sons. We talked about that in the last 2 weeks because of sin. And out of fear, he refuses to keep his promise to Tamar. So Tamar, a Canaanite, must deceive the deceiver to save the family line. And what's interesting about Perez is he never speaks in the Bible. He silently carries God's promise forward through every crucial moment in Israel's story because his name, Perez, will be mentioned 18 more times throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible in genealogies. And this matters because of how biblical genealogies work. Remember at the beginning of Genesis 37, we began this series with these are the genealogies of Jacob. But the phrase is really, these are the generations. The Hebrew word is toledot. The word is used in Genesis to introduce each of the major sections. There's 10 different genealogies in the book of Genesis. And it means what was birthed from. Marks each new chapter of God's promise to this family that is going to bring blessing to the nations. Now, later biblical authors had Genesis on their minds when they wrote genealogies of their own while they followed the same pattern in Genesis. And one of the most important genealogies is found in the book of Ruth. And by the time Ruth was written, Israel was in exile. And they're asking, do God's promises still stand? Ruth's not a victory story written when a king sat on the throne. This is a hope story, which is written long after the throne was empty, declaring that God's line, God's covenant, and God's hope are still alive, even if the world's circumstances don't seem to fit. Now, Ruth makes this hope concrete by ending with a genealogy that ties King David to his ancestor, Perez, the son of Judah and Tamar. Look at the blessing over Ruth and Boaz in the book of Ruth, Ruth chapter 4, verse 12. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar born to Judah through the seed that Adonai will give to you by this young woman. Well, there they are. Perez, Judah, and Tamar. But the emphasis here is on the word seed. Judah's son, Tamar, the promise to Isaac of a future seed. The promise in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, where the seed of the woman will step on the serpent's head, and ultimately points to a king, King David, who fulfills all of these promises in a seed. And then the book of Ruth ends with the same phrase, Toledot. These are the generations, Ruth chapter 4, verse 18. These are the Toledot of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. He must be from Seattle. Or at least Alaska. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. And Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. Now, Toledot, the generations of, in fact, there's 10 generations that are listed by the author of Ruth because he is thinking of Genesis. He has Genesis on his mind. In Genesis chapter 5, there's a 10-generation genealogy from Adam to Noah. In Genesis chapter 11, there's a 10-generation genealogy from Noah to Abraham. So Ruth adds another 10-generation genealogy from Perez to David. And by using the same 10-generation structure, the author of Ruth is claiming that David's reign as king is as significant a turning point in redemptive history as both the creation and the flood. David is the last word. His name is the last word of the book of Ruth. And the author's saying David is just as important as Adam and Noah and Abraham. There's a new age that's about to begin where the king who promised to sit on David's throne forever, this is going to happen next in Matthew, that there's one who will sit on the throne forever, and he will be born in the city of David, Bethlehem, a redeemer for Israel first, and also for anyone from any nation who calls on his name. So we fast forward 500 years. And a Jewish man named Matthew, in the first century in Israel, is writing a version of a story of the life and death of Yeshua. And Matthew has both Ruth and Genesis on his mind, because look at the way he opens his gospel. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, the book of the genealogy of Yeshua, the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham. But this phrase in Greek, the book of the genealogy, the Greek word for genealogy here is Genesis. It could actually read the scroll of Genesis, the beginning of Yeshua the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, Genesis is what the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, uses to translate the Hebrew word Toledot in Genesis, which we call Bereshit. Matthew is doing exactly what the author of Ruth did. He's signaling that a new beginning has arrived, a new chapter in God's story. In Genesis, Toledot, Genesis in Greek, introduces each major section: Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But Ruth uses it to introduce David, and Matthew uses it to connect Yeshua to David and introduce Yeshua. Right from the first verse, Matthew is saying, this is the continuation of the story of Israel and the bringing of blessing to the nations through this family. And before the genealogy begins, Matthew says these names. He says, Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham, ben David, ben Avram. Now, Yeshua means salvation. It's a variation of the name Joshua. The Lord is salvation. Yeshua literally means the salvation of Israel. Messiah, which in Greek is Christos, means anointed one. And what is the Messiah anointed for? He's anointed to be king of Israel in the line of King David and Judah. And so the first century expectation, 500 years from Babylonian exile, is the Messiah, the anointed one who will come and restore the throne of David. And this is where it gets super cool. This is for Bible nerds. So if this part makes you sleepy, just take a nap or skip a few, hit 30 seconds a few times. In ancient Hebrew, letters are also numbers. And Matthew structures his genealogy around the number 14. In fact, if you look at the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1, it's divided into 3 sections of 14 generations. Why 14? Because David's name in Hebrew equals the number 14. So it's 14, 14, 14, David, David, David. Now, interestingly, if you're good at math, which I'm not, I had to check 17 times, 14 times 3 sections of 14, equals 42. But the problem is, there's only 41 names. That's weird. But it's not weird if you understand that the numerical value of Abraham is 41. So Yeshua is the son of David, 14, or 14 times 3 sections, and the son of Abraham, 41. The promised seed to save Israel and the world. Now, in the 3 sections, the second section focuses on exile. In that section of the genealogy, we find Jeconiah, and his name in Hebrew adds up to the number 40. 40 is the number of exile. 40 years in the wilderness, 40 days of rain in the flood, 40 days of temptation in the desert. Jeconiah in this genealogy represents the exile and interruption of the kingly line. So Matthew's 3 sections of this genealogy in groups of 14 tell the story of Israel. The first section is the promise of Abraham to David. The second section is exile of the kings to and Babylon to Jeconiah to Babylon. And the last section is the return of the king, Yeshua, the Messiah, who is both the son of David, which is the number 14, and the son of Abraham, which is 41, the amount of people that are in the genealogy. The point is clear if you understand ancient Hebrew context. God's plan is structured, intentional, and prophetic, even through brokenness and exile and unexpected circumstances. This genealogy is not a random list. They're never random lists in the Bible. They signify God's faithfulness and the reality of exile and the ultimate arrival of the promised king through David and Judah. And as we walk through the genealogy, you got to keep your eyes open because Matthew decides to mention 4 women, each one caught in scandal, sexual scandal, and each one essential to the Messiah. So watch Matthew 1, verse 2. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac fathered Jacob, and Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. Now, this word, which we know, in the King James Version, is beget, is the same word. It's another version of the word toledot in Hebrew. It means to father or to begot or to have a child. And just like the genealogies in Genesis, this phrase doesn't mean that every single biological generation is listed in these groups of 14 because 14's the point. It functions as a marker of connection and promise that's being passed down through God's chosen line. And Matthew is tracing the line of promise, not providing a complete family tree. But we get to verse 3, and here they are again. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Tamar, who deceived her father-in-law, Judah, gets pregnant through what appears to be prostitution, and Judah declares she's more righteous than I, and they have a son, Perez, who breaks through and comes out first before his brother. One commentator said that this story, which at first sight seems so marginal to biblical history, records a vital link in saving history. Tamar, through her determination to have children, has secured for Judah the honor of fathering both David and the Savior of the world. The genealogy continues in verse 4. Ram fathered Amminadab, Amminadab fathered Nahshon, Nahshon fathered Salmon, and Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab. Now, Rahab is a prostitute from Jericho who hid the Israelite spies, Joshua and Caleb, and is commended for her faith in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31. Now, people ask, how could this be the same Rahab? Because it's a bit confusing. The order in most Bibles is Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And Judges is about 400 years. So because of the order of books, we imagine that Ruth is at the end of this period of Judges. But the period of Judges are not really in any order that matters. And the book of Ruth opens with, it was in the days of the Judges. So many scholars believe that Ruth actually takes place at the beginning of the period of Judges, right after Joshua. And Ruth was written after the Babylonian exile, but it's set closer to Joshua's time, which makes the connection between Rahab and Boaz chronologically possible. Matthew's gospel is the only Jewish writing source that connects Rahab as Boaz's mother. But it also probably reflects a tradition that was already believed by many Jewish people in the first century, because Matthew isn't inventing the connection, he's recording what was already part of how people understood their history in the first century. The point is when Matthew includes Rahab in Yeshua's genealogy, he's bringing in another Canaanite prostitute directly into the Messianic line. And his first century audience would have recognized this as part of the story of our people. Verse 5 continues that Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth. Well, here we go again. Ruth was a Moabite, a descendant of a nation born from incest. In Genesis, Lot sleeps with both of his daughters after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is an intentional hyperlink. There's a through line of scandal to salvation. There's two different lines that converge in the story of Ruth, in Boaz and Ruth. Lot's daughters have incest with their father, which creates the Moabites, Moab, which leads to Ruth. Judah and Tamar are a type of incest, father-in-law and daughter-in-law, which leads to Perez and eventually to Boaz. So when Ruth marries Boaz, two scandalous lines unite. In both of these lines, the Moabite line and the Judahite line originate in sexual irregular unions involving family deception. And Genesis and Ruth are in conversation with each other. They're showing that God's redemptive line flows through, not around human brokenness. And Ruth, like Tamar, through what could appear in the book of Ruth as sexual impropriety and careful deception, ensures the preservation of the family line and the promised seed. She orchestrates a plan at a harvest time party, approaches Boaz at night in a field after he's drunk from the party. Just like we talked about last week, that Judah was drunk after the sheep shearing before he encountered Tamar disguised as a prostitute. The book of Ruth is deliberately echoing the Tamar story. Both women take risky, unconventional action to preserve the family line when the men fail to act. And from Ruth and Boaz's union comes Obed, who fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David the king. David fathered Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Now, David the king is important because he's the only person other than Yeshua that has a title in this genealogy. And this is the connection that Ruth is making to David, Judah, and his son Perez. They're saying David is the king, and Matthew is saying that Yeshua is a descendant of David, who is a descendant of Perez, who is a descendant of Judah. And Matthew brings up Bathsheba, but he only refers to her as the wife of Uriah. But the reason for this, I think, is he highlights David's sexual scandal. David committed adultery with her and then orchestrated the murder of her Hittite husband Uriah to cover it up. But it's from this union that we get Solomon, through whom the royal line will continue to Yeshua, according to Matthew. This was a story of deception and scandal. It involved a daughter of Israel who married a Gentile, showing once again that God works through brokenness to preserve his promises. It's another hyperlink to Judah and Tamar. And here, I think, is one of the coolest things that I discovered, learned from watching the Bible Project class on Matthew and on Joseph, where it's in 1 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 5. There's a genealogy of David. And Bathsheba is mentioned, the mother of Solomon, is mentioned, but she's called Bathsheba in 1 Chronicles 3. It's an intentional extra hyperlink. Judah's Canaanite wife before Tamar, who had no name, was the daughter of Shua. That's Bathsheba. And in 1 Chronicles, the author of 1 Chronicles, in a genealogy, refers to Bathsheba as Bathsheba. It creates a deliberate echo. Judah to Bathsheba to sexual scandal to Perez. David to Bathsheba to sexual scandal to Solomon. The chronicler is signaling that history repeats itself. Patriarch to the king, scandal for scandal. What happened with Judah happens again with David, and in both cases, God's promise moves forward anyway. Because this is what happens when God breaks through. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and the wife of Uriah are all caught in sexual scandal or suspicion, yet God uses them to preserve the Messiah's line. In Matthew, Mary is pregnant. Joseph knows it's not his child. And from the outside, this looks like adultery, fornication, a broken promise, public shame. Joseph has every legal and social right to divorce her according to the Torah. But Matthew is saying, first, you got to look at the genealogy of this family. Look who's already in this line. Tamar, a Canaanite who was caught in sexual scandal. Rahab, a prostitute in Jericho. Ruth, a Moabite who had a risky nighttime encounter with Boaz. And the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba, who had adultery with David, and David murdered her husband. They're all caught in sexual scandal or suspicion, but they are all vindicated by God, and they are all essential to the line of the Messiah. And Matthew intentionally preserves the language of scandal throughout the genealogy. Each story involves real sexual sin, deception, or abuse of power, but God works through it. But the brokenness is not minimized. When Matthew arrives at Mary and Joseph, the pattern changes. By now, in the genealogy, Matthew has trained us to expect another scandal. But there's no sexual scandal. There's only the appearance of one. Because Mary conceives by the Holy Spirit in obedience, not deception. And Joseph responds, not with power and secrecy or self-protection, but with righteousness and trust. That's why Matthew 1:16 says, and Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Miriam, from whom was born Yeshua, who is called the Messiah. Matthew calls Joseph the husband of Mary because it's highlighting his covenant faithfulness rather than betrayal. But Joseph does what David did not. He refuses to misuse his authority. He listens to God. He protects Mary. He names the child, and he adopts him into the line of David. And in first century Judaism, in the Second Temple period, and in the Torah, adoption is a legal form of bringing someone into your line. God has always advanced his promises through human failure. But with Mary and Joseph, we finally see something different. Yeshua is not scandal redeemed after the fact, but obedience in real time. And Joseph and Mary's faithfulness doesn't replace grace. It reveals what grace was always moving history toward. That's why it says Miriam from whom was born, instead of Joseph begot. It's the same verb as the rest of the chapter, but it's passive rather than active. The passive leaves Joseph intentionally excluded as the begetter, while still announcing Yeshua legally in David's line through him. Tim Mackey says that God repeatedly uses surprising people from outside the family lineage through surprising and unconventional means to rescue the chosen ones from destroying themselves. And at the end, God chooses a faithful Israelite couple from Bethlehem, the city of David, and the city of Ruth and Boaz, to do what others in the line could not do. And here's the idea. If God worked through Tamar's deception and Rahab's prostitution and Ruth's risky night and Bathsheba's tragedy, then maybe, just maybe, this scandalous pregnancy isn't what it looks like. Maybe God is at work again in the most unexpected and most miraculous way through a virgin birth. And every time it looks like the promise is in jeopardy through the scripture, God breaks through. So what does this mean for you? First, your scandals don't disqualify you. If the Messiah's genealogy includes prostitutes, adultery, murder, and deception, then your past doesn't disqualify you from God's future. Your story's not too broken. You are not too late. You are not too compromised to be carried forward. But notice, the genealogy doesn't end with scandal. It ends with obedience. And God can redeem you from your past while calling you forward to a future of faithfulness. Second, God specializes in impossible situations. When things look most compromised, most scandalous, most impossible, that's often where God does his best work. Not despite the mess, but through it. Sometimes it's through redeeming scandal. Sometimes it's through faithful obedience. But always, God breaks through. The third is how much greater. It's a rabbinic principle from lesser to greater. It sometimes expresses how much greater. It shows up clearly in the stories of these four women in Matthew's genealogy: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Each one of them flawed, compromised, or caught in scandal. Yet God uses them to advance his covenant promise. The point is simple. The blessing does not depend on our character or on our circumstances. It depends on God. And if he could work through Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, then why not you? How much greater could he work through you? And if he could work through Mary and Joseph's faithful obedience, then he can work through yours too. And if he could bring the Messiah through scandal, risk, brokenness, and obedience, then he can bring his purposes through your story too. Matthew doesn't hide the scandals. He highlights them by simply naming the women in the genealogy, but he also doesn't hide the obedience. He's showing us that God's redemptive line includes both grace for the broken and a call to faithfulness. The gospel, the good news of Yeshua, is about God breaking through in the most unlikely, most miraculous ways through scandalous, broken human partners who are being transformed into faithful ones. So my friends, today, if your life feels scandalous and compromised or impossible right now, you're in exactly the kind of situation where God loves to work. That's when God breaks through. Even in your darkest, weakest, or most compromised moments, there is light, strength, and restoration in Yeshua, who died and rose from the dead. God's promise doesn't die in scandal. It breaks through. Tamar broke through. Rahab broke through. Ruth broke through. Bathsheba broke through. Perez broke through at birth. Mary and Joseph broke through in obedience. And Yeshua broke through the tomb from death to life. Not despite scandal. Not around brokenness. But sometimes through scandal. Sometimes through obedience. But always right through it. That's what God does when everything looks impossible. I hope as you celebrate holidays, Hanukkah and Christmas and whatever you celebrate, that you celebrate the goodness and greatness of God. And we're going to take a 2-week break for these holidays, and then we'll continue our series again in the second week of January. I love you guys, and I can't wait to see you then.